Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Management, as we had seen, is decision making and problem solving with resource optimization. If that is the definition of management, then the core concern of management can and only be effectiveness. Now, effectiveness as a concept, like many other such intangible ideas, can have shades of meaning, but these shades of meaning have subcomponents which, when considered, bring clarity into what is meant by the word. So, in this case, effectiveness could be broken up into efficiency and excellence. So, when one is managing for effectiveness, one is managing for efficiency and excellence. We have earlier on noticed that efficiency can be at times a mechanical effort, a mechanical outcome which really no tangible results. Like, for example, a car may have machinery in top working gear. It may have a brilliant seminizing job. It may be polished to a point where you can almost see your face in the shining exterior, very efficiently done up. But if it does not drive to any destination, it does not really matter. The efficiency of the machine, the efficiency of the polishing effort is to no avail. So, to that one adds the concept of excellence. It must in performance reach the highest possible level. Together, it constitutes effectiveness. Now, in covering as we have through the different topics that we have covered, concerns of understanding organizations, that of engineering business, structure, process, design, cybernetics systems, socio-technical systems. The time has come to ask, what does this all total up to? And this can only total up to effectiveness of results. I am going to spend some time with you in looking at the effectiveness parameters of managerial action, but then one must be quite clear that effectiveness is both internal to the actor, which is the individual, in this case the manager, and external in terms of the efficacy of machines and the environment in the organization. So, there will be number of aspects surfacing our attention, and you would do well to understand that whereas they are interrelated, the treatment is independent. The first concept of effectiveness is forever self development or self management. If you are yourself not evolved and if you are not managing yourself well, there is no way in which results would come. For example, you can't deal with any manager, any decision maker with any degree of success unless he has some self discipline, unless he manages himself in a way in which he is a reliable person to deal with. If he is not a reliable person to deal with, then any kind of transaction may be converted 20 times over into any legal document, but it will have no meaning, because how often can you go to the courts? Hence, self development is the first building block of effectiveness. There should be considerable scope for self development beyond performing the immediate task requirements of the job, which means the immediate task performance has to be a necessary ingredient, but this necessary ingredient does not go far enough, and above all what is said here, it does not take place automatically. One has to have conscious efforts at managing oneself, developing oneself, not just as a person, but also in terms of skills, given the continuously changing nature of the environment, and that has to be done deliberately. Be that as it may, some reasons which need to be considered is the effectiveness parameters requires that there should be no organizational waste. There should be no wastage of resources, material or intangible, no wastage of material, no wastage of energy, in fact, no wastage of time. Any organization which can't contain wastage is doomed to decline and possibly destruction. Managers have to be aware of what the concerns are. The basic requirement is of being aware of a need. Unless you know that a need exists, you can't respond to it. Unless you know what the methods are of arriving at a solution, you will never arrive at a solution. You can't arrive at a solution in a hit and a miss manner. Similarly, you can't be effective if you are short sighted. You can't be effective if you are indulging in self pity, and worst of all, you can't be effective if you are complacent and believe that things will take care of themselves. To put it simply, therefore, it is essential to understand that effectiveness requires a whole set of operational attitudes, without which effectiveness can only be a matter of cerebral elaboration and nothing of operational significance. So, what is it that I have said in the last few minutes? Please contain waste, please enhance awareness, both in specific terms and in general terms. You can't be a manager with short-sighted perspective, with bigotedness, with petty considerations, with a personal agenda, with personal likes and dislikes. Forget about effectiveness if that is the way you work. In fact, each manager is supposed to be well above any concern of the lesser human beings. The managerial job requires considerable alertness, considerable confidence in one's own ability, and like everything else, it is walking the middle path. You can't suffer from a lack of confidence, and yet you can't have overconfidence. Somewhere between a lack of confidence and overconfidence is the necessary confidence to perform effectively. And you did hear me say that complacency is not something which should be indulged in. Very often, managers are of the notion that decision making is common sense. We have discussed how this is palpably a position which cannot be sustained. Everything is common sense, but then everything has to be learnt. Let me give you an illustration. A lot of physics is common sense. The basic building blocks of physics include understanding heat and light. Anyone can learn through experience that if you rub two stones, heat will be generated. But you do not have to go eternally rubbing stones to discover the principle. The learning process will tell you that rubbing stones generates heat and you carry it into operational life. Therefore, your experience is abbreviated. Also, everything can't be learnt, because learning equated with experience creates a problem. Learning very often has to be extended to applied imagination. You read a situation, you apply your imagination, you get to understand what it is like. For example, if you want to know what life in jail is like, you do not have to go to jail and stay there for a given period to understand what life there can be like. You can talk to a person who has been in jail, you can talk to a person who has seen it, you can read about it, or you can build upon your learning of what happens when you are locked up in a situation, denied movement, what happens when your autonomy of action is taken away, what happens when a schedule is given to you, the basic ingredients of a jail life, and then you put it together and you say, being in jail can be like this. In other words, there are limits to experience, there are limits to learning by again exposure. Learning and knowledge can be through applied imagination. Learning and knowledge can be through your ability of putting together what you have already known through one source or another into a new architecture of experience, which is perhaps best labeled under applied imagination. So, to be effective, you can't just say that I will learn on the job, or management is common sense, I am a good engineer, I am a good doctor, I am a good lawyer. Oh, management I have been doing all the time, I have been practicing it. No, management is a discipline in its own right, where the wherewithal has to be picked up much in the same manner in which you learn, you grow and you practice to be an engineer. Experience is of course, an important underpinning, but experience is very often checking out what you have acquired elsewhere. So, I want to bring to your attention a simple theme: limitations of experience by itself. Experience by itself does not really go far. Work experience has potential for self development, provided the individual has the aptitude for learning. But here again, experience has to be leavened with reading, has to go hand in hand with applied imagination, and as the expression already used stands, you have to create a new architecture of what is there in your knowledge kit to perceive a new situation. So, work experience has potential for self development, provided the individual has aptitude for learning, and aptitude for learning is what I have just explained. Experience brings success and failure, whereas getting the building blocks of knowledge, whereas getting the basic wherewithal of performance does not carry with it success and failure, but carries with it a simple process of value addition. There is scope for learning from both, that is failure as well as success, but perhaps learning is more from failure. You at least know what is not to do. So, what is it that I am trying to convey to you? Learning, value addition, acquisition of knowledge, the broadening of the cognitive frame is a complex phenomena. Effectiveness is very often rooted in this complex phenomena, and as an aspiring manager or as a practicing manager who wishes to reinforce his experience, it is impossible to do so without putting in place a complex integrated framework of experience, learning, acquiring knowledge, applied imagination, creating a new architecture of the experiences you have to get into situations which you have never got into, and keep continuously reinforcing it. Experience also provides opportunities for testing one's approach, and this is a very important dimension of experience. You notice how I have added to experience the concept of acquisition of knowledge, of learning, by implication reading, by implication acquiring a new architecture of applied imagination by putting together different experiences, learning, building blocks which you have already acquired. But then what needs to be added is all the other sources of value addition to one's cognitive system can be tested only in one manner, that is experience. You may believe your applied imagination has got you to some conclusion. If it is about an empirical situation, then you better check it out whether the architecture of converting what you know into a new situation is actually tested. It will be soulful to be reminded at this stage that experience can also be a burden, because if the experience is of failure, if the experience is of repeatedly attempting, but attempting unsuccessfully, then it becomes a burden. and it requires a whole wherewithal to rise above your negative experiences. Therefore, your effectiveness cannot be only a subset of experience. Experience can in certain ways reduce your effectiveness. If you do not have the psychological wherewithal, as I was suggesting, to convert that negative experience into a learning process and creating in your work style buffers which prevent you from making that mistake over and over again. Fortuitous success may include complacency. This is another alert which needs to be sounded. It is not as if success is always deserved. Success can be by chance. Success can be by default of others. Success can come as a surprise to yourself. Success can be, yes, and it is possible, just a divine blessing. If that converts your mental frame into complacency and helps you to believe that you are a great achiever, then that is going to impair the effectiveness of your subsequent action. Therefore, look at this slide as some of the cautions which need to be exercised in looking at the foundations of effectiveness in work situations. If the organization has weak goal setting and performance evaluation process, then the experience is not demanding on an individual. So, like everything else in management, here too the socio-technical system approach makes a significant contribution, and it moves on the usual two wheels: personal parameters of action and exogenous and objective parameters of action. The personal parameters of action have been elaborated on in certain manner. A word needs to be put in on the exogenous factors of effectiveness, and which is where you are being reminded that an organization which has weak goal setting and performance evaluation process does not make many demands of an individual's experience. So, effectiveness has as one of its concerns the kind of structure, process and procedures, not to overlook the design which an organization has, and effectiveness is really the outcome of a whole set of variables which at times can be complex, but more than the complexity, their interaction decides the kind of new shapes which they can acquire if the interaction of the various institutional processes is not focused. Some early unlearning of fallacious conclusions from one's experience held as self-evident truths is necessary for future development. This is a very important concept. None of us get into a managerial situation in an abstraction. A managerial situation is always a given reality. Certain things existed before you got into the situation, and certain things will by definition be out of control. The art of effectiveness will help you to identify what are the elements which are in your control and you can change, and what are the elements which are out of control and which you cannot change. And if there are parameters which you cannot change, then you have to accept them as constants, and they may contribute towards your effectiveness, and let me alert you, they may also contribute towards your lack of effectiveness, but those are the facts of life, you can't alter it. Then there are elements within you, because when you got into a situation, it was not the first situation you got into. You had been in previous situations earlier on. You had come to your own conclusions by those experiences, and those experiences would have created a situation where you had come to certain conclusions, certain assumptions about human nature, and these assumptions and these conclusions about human nature, about the nature of managerial action, about just about anything, are as wide as they can be, at times almost 180 degrees apart. I will give you an example. There are various theories about the origin of the civil society. Nobody really knows how civil society began. Now, people who have expounded upon the origin of the civil society are people who have tried to understand how the first social contract could have been written, and they are called social contract theoreticians. Amongst them, three names are significant: Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. We do not have time to get into the theories which all three of them propounded, but suffice it be for our purposes to understand that Locke assumes that the state of nature was nasty, brutish and short, and therefore, troubled by the state of nature, human beings entered a contract with each other to have a king who could protect them and shield the not so strong from troubles of human experience, and that is how civil society was born. Hobbes, on the other hand, believes that the state of nature was idyllic, clearly 180 degrees different from the first social contractualists. But the situation was so idyllic, so ideal, that as it began to deteriorate, people said we better stick to the state of idyllic existence, and therefore, they entered a social contract and created a king. Now, both Hobbes and Locke talk of the creation of a civil society, but they talk of from two totally different perspectives. Neither of them have any evidence for making the assumptions which they have made. Similarly, managers enter work situations with a lot of assumptions about nature of people, nature of events, life experiences, decision making. You know it, that a lot of people have views just about on everything, and even if they do not have views on everything, a lot of people have conclusions to which they have come arising out of life's learning. The way to be an effective manager is to unlearn what you carry in your intellectual baggage and prepare to face a situation which faces you in that job with a completely open mind. Let me repeat that. An effective manager faces a managerial situation with a completely open mind. He makes no assumptions about human nature. He does not go by what has been fed to him, conveyed to him about the person he is dealing with. He carries no prejudices onto the job from caste, religion, region, you name it. But he handles the situation, he reacts to the situation in an unprogrammed manner, ready to absorb. Now, when you do that, you are showing a remarkable maturity in understanding the situation the way it is, without passing through a refraction which will happen if the external situation has to be judged through the prism of your own notions. So, effectiveness as a manager requires unlearning of several of the fallacious conclusions from one's experience, which to oneself one holds as self-evident truths, but does not necessarily hold when you get to an objective situation. So, continuing the discussion on dimensions of self-development, what are the additional concerns a manager must bring to his job? The manager must feel pride, and he must feel definite pride in his skills. In fact, his pride in the skills should be higher than his pride in anything else. To make it abundantly clear, let me put it as simply as I can to state that managerial action must by definition be skill based, and a person will be skill based if he recognizes that managerial action requires skills, and he also understands that he is the best person to handle it, because he believes he has the necessary skills to deal with the situation. Skill cannot be just a cognitive affair. Management is a craft which deals with practice. Management learning is the making of a practitioner. If management learning is the making of a practitioner, then skill becomes the ability to use ideas in action. Ideas are not good enough. Good ideas have to be put into operational reality and made to work. If a good idea does not work, then to continue with the use of the same word, it may not be such a good idea. But there are different types of skills required from managerial effectiveness, and one needs to have this whole range of skills. These skills can be listed as technical skills, behavioral skills, conceptual skills, administrative skills. All these 4 skills are necessary for being an effective manager. No prizes for guessing, but going back to the elaboration which we have already undertaken, it is simple to recognize that a manager, to be effective in any job, must have the technical skills. Now, technical skills does not necessarily mean being a technical man. In fact, the word technical itself has a wide range of connotations. The soft skills which one has can also make a technical man. For example, if you are able to analyze the inputs which go into the calculation of an income tax payable in an income tax return, you are not dealing with any machinery, you have the technical skills required to understand what income tax calculation is all about, and there you are a technical man. But the proposition which I want to draw your attention to is something beyond and apart from a much needed, but obvious definition of what technical skills is. And the consideration which I want you to internalize is that you can be a technical man, and please remember how I define technical, but even without being a technical man, to be in a managerial job, you must have an appreciation of the technical skills required. In other words, being technical means you can actually operate those skills. Appreciation of those skills requires a situation where you cannot operate it, but you can appreciate the concerns. So, technical skills are very much a part of the managerial profile of any incumbent of a job. You will recall that the second skill listed there was behavioral skill. In the ultimate analysis, behavioral skills are required in whatever situation you be in. You must know how to talk to people. You must know what choice of words you want to use. You must be in control of your intonation, your pitch of the voice, because you alter the pitch of the voice and you can convey a different message. If you talk in a high pitch, then you give one message. If you talk in a soft pitch, you give another message, and the list of behavioral skills are long. The behavioral skills one acquires from the moment the cognitive system is alerted. Even the child has behavioral skills. The child knows that if it wants to be fed, it needs to convey a message and reverberate it with sound. Accordingly, when the child is hungry, it lets you know. So, a lot of behavioral skills are experimentations in different types of behavior, and that predictably leads to theorizing. Those skills which are successful in getting the desired impact of results tend to be reinforced. You tend to use them over and over again because you know it works. On the other hand, there may be things, there may be actions on your part which do not get the desired results, and when they do not get the desired results, they tend to be shed. So, a behavioral learning takes place, and you learn, if I do this, I do not get the desired results. So, behavioral skills of course require a cognitive understanding and an acquiring of the techniques of skills related to behavior, but above all the behavioral pattern is rooted in your perception of what works and what does not work for you. Then there are the concepts. The concepts are important in life because concepts represent the distillation of learning, knowledge, value additive process to the cognitive system, and all that goes into making a human being a thinking person. The concept that I am talking about has to do with certain abstractions. For example, effectiveness is itself a concept. You can't touch effectiveness. You can only experience effectiveness. So, the whole treatment of the subject here is to lend specificity and concreteness of understanding to a concept which to begin with may appear so simple that you would not know what is there to study in it, or may appear so complex that you may say, oh my God, how am I going to study it? So, the conceptual skills are important in life. What is a marriage? What is teaching? What is learning? What is gaining acceptability? What is popularity? All these are concepts which need to be understood with specific technical, behavioral, social manifestations. And finally, we come to the fourth skill, the administrative skill. The manager ultimately is also an administrator. What is the difference between managing and administering? In administering, you put on ground a given line of thought which is rooted in the policy, strategy, the action plan which has been given to you. So, you act upon the action plan and you put it on the ground. When you are a manager, then it is also your job to generate options of problem solving, and above all, as a manager, you decide upon techniques and you have to work with resource optimization, because that is the part of your managerial job. Remember, management is decision making and problem solving with resource optimization. It does not mean that an administrator does not have to practice resource optimization. Of course, he has to, but it is a question of ratio. The role of resource optimization is much higher in a managerial job as compared to the space for resource optimization in an administrative job. An administrative job has therefore a DNA which is slightly different from a managerial job. The tendency of some managers to engage in theory versus practice debate portrays a lack of awareness of their own theory. You will hear some managers say, that is theoretical, I am practical. Now, there is no space to discuss that kind of erroneous assumption, but I have an obligation to draw your attention to the fact that even the most practical person has his own theory. In fact, a practical person operates in the theory that theory is not relevant, but practices that itself is a theory. The important thing then is to update their theory and deploy their well honed skills with relevant theoretical knowledge, and this is a more appropriate formulation which I want to share with you to understand a very simple proposition. Theory and practice are really mutually complementary and reinforcing. What's more, theory can never be frozen. It has to be constantly updated. It has to be constantly upgraded, and that is the connotation of effectiveness which I want to share with you. You can't be effective without your concepts being absolutely online updated. And what makes a concept online and updated? It is being consistent with the requirements of the environment. So, we are back again to the same proposition. The truth is, without knowledge there is no profession, and hence effectiveness is always in certain critical ways a practice of knowledge management. Self development consists also in using one's knowledge and skills with wisdom and vision. I am helping you to get the connotation of the word self development, because it is possible to ascribe to self development a rather simplistic meaning, but it requires use of one's knowledge. Therefore, it is in the domain of knowledge management, use of one's skills, and therefore, it is a craft, but both the exercises have to be done with wisdom and with vision. For this, managers need right kind of attitudes and underlying values, and that is self obvious. It has been repeated earlier on also. Organizations pay a high hidden cost for self seeking and conflict prone behavior of managers with advanced knowledge and sharp skills. Here is a danger to which I would like to draw your attention. If you are a person with advanced knowledge and sharp skills, and incidentally most of us do believe that we have very good knowledge and we have sharp skills. Of course, there are doubting Thomases and there are people who suffer from lack of confidence, but they are not a very large group of people. Most people do believe that they are very talented. If you consider yourself excessively knowledgeable, then of course, you are putting up windows in acquiring more knowledge. And if you believe you have sharp skills to a point of fault, then you will do nothing about keeping those skills alive. And if you do not keep those skills alive, you will get to be a rusty manager. Therefore, the proposition that is being put across to you is organizations can pay a high price, and it can be all by way of hidden costs for self seeking and conflict prone behavior. Organizations which are torn apart by self seeking managers and managers which are perennially in conflict do tend to take a downward spiral. Therefore, the values for internalization become the following. They require excellence, they require cooperation, they require innovation, and they acquire responsibility. So, whether it is excellence, cooperation, innovation and responsibility, let me quickly walk you through this so that you get its correlation to effectiveness. Excellence is quality in all aspects of work discharge, quality which approximates the highest level of performance, appearance, effectiveness in that task, and if the optimal effectiveness on that particular task becomes the quality of excellence, which then contributes to the overall effectiveness. So, again I am trying to show to you how excellence, which itself is pregnant with the notion of effectiveness in its work discharge, in turn integrates the result of those tasks to present a quality framework, which then contributes to overall results. For this, cooperation is necessary. Cooperation between jobs, cooperation between departments, cooperation between individuals, and you can't have a conflict prone situation being effective. You also need innovation. You need continuously quicker, better, faster and different ways of task discharge, so that the changing environment is appropriately responded to by the internal work methods. And finally, responsibility, responsibility for action, responsibility for your own decisions, responsibility for managing yourself, and above all responsibility for the results. These are values for internalization so far as the study of effectiveness parameters is concerned, and there is more to come.